Welcome to episode 14 of Feeling Through Live. Today we're talking with Ryan Odland, and the primary topic of conversation is going to be ADA30, and how far we've come and where we still need to go. The reason we're spending a lot of time talking about ADA30 this month is because ADA30 stands for the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which turns 30 on, I believe it's July 25th, is the 30th anniversary of that act. And we'll be talking about more about what it is, why it's important, how it functions, the improvements that still need to be made. And we're very fortunate to be joined by Ryan Odland from the Helen Keller National Center, who knows a ton about all of this and certainly has a lot to say. So hello, Ryan. Thank you for joining us again today.
Hello, this is Rylan. I'm happy to join and to talk about the ADA this afternoon.
Well, Ryan, it's one of the things that's really cool here. We're in episode 14 of Feeling Through Live. Again, this was born out of really needing to find a way to continue to connect during COVID. And what's really cool is, Ryan, you were our very first guest on episode 1. So we'd said back then that we needed to have you back. So it's so cool to, have you back here on episode 14.
Yes.
So, I guess there's plenty to talk about as far as ADA 30 is concerned, but just to kind of talk about something else first, the very first topic of conversation, and something that's obviously still very relevant, is COVID, coronavirus, something that certainly has been ramping up lately. And being that the very first episode was about how the COVID was affecting the deafblind community, I kind of want to just check in with you a number of weeks later for an update on that. If you have anything kind of new to share on that, in that category since we first spoke, about 14 weeks ago.
Sure. This is Ryan speaking. There's actually been a lot of changes in these 14 weeks. 2.5 months really. We're learning as we go and trying to figure out the best way to keep ourselves safe and manage this situation with the pandemic. And for deafblind individuals, really, we've been trying to sort of just get our basic needs met and try to find the best approach to that. Just our basic needs for living, and finding even that love and connection and communication with people, how to shop, how to continue working in this new world that we're in, and to really just, make sure that we stay healthy. And it does present a lot of challenges. But we are, keeping busy, finding different resources that are available for accessibility, finding different individuals who are able to assist us in our homes, and also managing profitable businesses. Just getting everyday needs met, like grocery shopping, or continuing to live our lives, and how we approach that, how we do that in the day-to-day, is very different than what it looked like before COVID.
And When we first spoke about it a number of weeks ago, COVID was a lot newer then. We were just starting to lock things down. There were still a lot. There's still a lot of questions, but there were even more questions then as to how this was going to play out, how much it was going to spread. Certainly, we're still learning that, but we're a little farther along now. And I know, obviously in the deafblind community specifically, a community that often relies largely on touch, there were a lot of concerns specifically around not being able to get the essential services like a service support provider or a tactile interpreter that are really needed for a lot of the community to function on a regular basis. How has that evolved since we first spoke 14 weeks ago? Have some of those services opened up again in at safest ways they can do it? Are they still largely not functioning? What changes there have been specifically around the services for the deafblind community since we first spoke about COVID 14 weeks ago?
Well, really, to be honest with you, Doug, the situation is pretty much the same as it was those 14 weeks ago. There are some one-to-one services that have been implemented now, but there are many services that, are happening remotely. And, the reason being that the states are still sort of in this process of reopening. And some of the vendors and businesses are not yet caught up to speed, as far as their safety plans. They're not necessarily in place with a definitive COVID safety plan. So, not everyone agrees on, the wearing of masks and using that PPE, that personal protective equipment. The support services are, that's still a challenge. And it's really all, just basically because of this health concern. Support providers, SSPs, are not comfortable because of COVID, and interpreters are not comfortable to meet one-to-one with deafblind individuals. So it's something that, we are hopeful and motivated that will continue to change, but not everyone's on the same page, so to speak, at this point. There are a lot of deafblind individuals who are in isolation, and that's a struggle. That's a real struggle right now due to COVID.
And something I would say is, if there's anyone watching this broadcast who knows anyone who feels particularly isolated in the deafblind community right now and maybe doesn't know about feeling through, please direct them to that. One of the primary things we're trying to do during this time is to help keep that community going and provide some opportunity for people to still connect, albeit virtually. And certainly that's one of the many reasons we make this as accessible as possible so that everyone can join in. And I also want to note that Allison Burrows from HKNC has just corrected me here. The ADA was signed on July 26th, not 25th. So thank you, Allison, for catching that. And she also notes that 2 HKNC staff members represented the center at the signing on the south lawn of the White House, which is a very cool piece of history there for Helen Keller National Center. So a nice extra shout out to HKNC today for being a part of that monumental day there on July 26th, 1990. So thank you, Allison, for that. So just one more primary question that I have, Ryan, about COVID before we move into ADA30 is, like you just mentioned, unfortunately not a ton has changed as far as what's able to be provided, how to kind of better things right now. Do you know of or have any thoughts around any plans for how that can be bettered? Is there a solution, or are we still kind of in a waiting game seeing how this all plays out?
I think there are a lot of different approaches, for individuals who are deafblind, and services that could change, but maybe it's focusing more on family or people in the home for that support. Myself, I am an advocacy trainer, and I use tactile sign language for communication. For an individual who lives with a roommate who may be willing to facilitate that communication via tactile sign language, then it is possible for me to work with those individuals remotely if they have that support in their homes and they can continue to learn. But it's definitely, it's a collaborative effort that we all need to really work on together and utilize the resources that we have. But really, I think key is having that know-how and ability to advocate for yourself, because in a situation like we're under right now with the pandemic, we really have to get creative, and those individuals who are more comfortable with advocacy, maybe would be able to facilitate that a little better for themselves. But we are, developing a plan of service. That's another approach. But really, I think key is just figuring out how to support each other, because this is just such a huge impact on everybody, and it changes day to day, week to week, and our perspectives are, understanding how an individual who is deafblind and what their perspective might be and what their needs might be is important.
Ryan, you mentioned a very important topic to today's discussion about ADA30, which is people advocating for themselves, which is certainly a very important aspect of the ADA, which we'll get into shortly, and certainly something that has proven to be more and more important in what's happening right now in the world. So as we shift into ADA30 now, just for all of you watching, if you're watching on Facebook, please hit the share button. It allows more people to join us, learn about ADA30, why it's important, what it is. If you're watching on YouTube, please feel free to share that link with anyone you think might want to join us. We still got plenty to talk about today, plenty of time for people to be joining in, so please do so. So moving on here, Ryan, I think it's still, let's just start simply with, there are obviously a lot of people on who are familiar with the ADA, but I'm sure there's some people joining us today who aren't. So why don't we just start off with just, if you could just explain, what the ADA is.
Sure. The ADA was passed in 1990, and it is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the intention of the ADA was really to provide equal rights and equal access to services. And really, it's been rooted in 100 years of many different issues and problems that have arisen over time. But it was formally written into law in 1990. So if you are interested in the history, you can look that up. But I think right now we're going to focus a little bit more on the law itself. And there are 5 different areas that it covers. The first being employment, which is a huge part of the law, actually. And it protects individuals who are capable of working with the emphasis on limiting discrimination, especially during the interview process. If an individual is capable and meets the qualifications for a particular job, as an applicant, maybe if they were to use Braille, for example, it really would focus on the process of the interview, which possibly could add an interpreter as an accommodation, which would be upheld by the ADA. Other individuals may need to incorporate a listening device, such as an FM system, to be able to go on through that interview. And the ADA really institutes reasonable accommodations for people in the workplace as far as accessibility, and making sure that they have the accommodations that they need set up so that they are able to perform their job duties. So it's not a mandated requirement. That is one thing I want to make clear. It's just that it's the responsibility of the hiring entity to be aware of and to make those reasonable accommodations for those individuals who need them. So that is the first area.
And Ryan, can I just hold for 1 second there? Before we move, because just a question about that first area, because you touched on something that I think is really important, and I know I just learned this recently, and I just want to talk about it a little bit more. But you said it's not like a requirement, but that it's also like making the reasonable adjustments. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that and how that functions? Because I think for me, prior to learning about this month, I assumed that there were very concrete guidelines that people had to adhere to, and that there was maybe some authority that was enforcing these. And now I've learned that it doesn't quite function like that. So can you explain that a little bit more? Because I think it's really interesting.
Sure, no problem. Let me expand on that a little bit. And it is actually reasonable accommodations. That's the formal language that's used within the law. And what that really means is it's focusing how to really meet an individual's needs in order for them to perform their job duties. So it's really accommodating that individual within the workplace in order for them to be able to do their daily job functions. It is not something that is required. If it does not pertain to the job duties. If you want to add that additional support, that would really be up to the employer. But in order to meet the responsibilities for the job and the position that they were hired for, that's really what it means. And that's really an important piece of the law. The second part focuses on state and local governments. and program services. Because prior to the ADA, those accommodations were not required to be provided. Communication access for programs wasn't necessarily met, and those accessibility needs were not necessarily met. So there are other accessibility considerations other than just communication as it pertains to program services. So for an example, an architect who's designing a building, they have universal design, and they all follow that standard. So for example, architects, they would have to include a ramp, curbs, certain distance requirements, sidewalks. There are a lot of different examples of what needs to be included in that universal design, and building standards that are required as accommodations. And that goes for all this construction. Public accommodations would be, for example, in a restaurant or a hairstylist, grocery store, different areas like that. And those also require accessibility. So for example, if you were in a store like Walgreens, a pharmacy, the labeling needs to be clear and descriptive. That would just be one example. Another might be in a restaurant. A menu, an accommodation to a menu would be that it would include Braille, or that that menu would be available at least. In an airport, the safety procedures would need to be available, readily available in these different ways, just so that they would have that access. Public transportation, for example, buses, subways, trains, those all need to be fully accessible for individuals with different disabilities. And how that might pertain to something like a bus or a train. For example, driver announcements, typically they're spoken and spoken English, arrivals and destinations. So an accommodation would be having that, that captioning up above and signage that's visible to other passengers who might not be able to access that auditorily. Any information on schedules would need to be readily available in different modes as well, like on the internet, for example. So in the 1990s, deaf individuals used TTYs, teletypewriters, for communications, and that was in lieu of using a phone for vocal calls. But as that use sort of diminished over time, because of course the ADA was established and there was, that requirement for accessibility in communications, various services have added other accommodations for the deaf and deafblind and their telecommunications. And that's really guided via the law, and that's really been the focus Yeah, so the ADA is possibly a little outdated, but it is still valid. And there are other additional legislations to support as well. So in 2008, there was the addition of additional accommodations, which meant because of the law in 1990, and it was a little vague, it wasn't completely clear, and there had been various court cases and legal battles going back and forth, trying to really figure out exactly what the language meant. Congress did pass in 2008 an amendment, and that pertains to language. So since that time, we've been able to preserve the ADA and really build upon it.
So that's a great place to just hold for one moment. We're going to do an interpreter switch. All right, we're all set? Great. So continuing. So Ryan, I think this is a good time to go to a couple questions that we have from viewers. Bethany Davis asks, is having the digital displays on buses and trains enough for deafblind people? Is there a better way for public transportation to communicate destinations and routes to deafblind people?
This is Ryan signing. Wow, what a fantastic question. And to be honest, the answer is both yes and no. For some people, some individuals, they can access that. And it depends on what their vision is. There may be some situations where it does, and they are able to access it, but some not. There are some tools that are out there we have that are being monetized. We're coming up with new ideas, but they're not quite perfect. So when we encounter an issue, and when a deafblind person encounters that sort of issue on a bus or a transit system, the transit system sends out those alerts via the phone text. That is one way they can get information. So that resolves that barrier that they might encounter with display by getting those texts. But it could also be delayed. So let's say you need some specific information for an accommodation, but you're on the bus, let's say, or you're physically on the train. How do deafblind people know that they need to get off at a specific stop that they'd like to get off at? And that requires more communication. We need to still develop that telecommunication to be able to communicate with the driver, for the driver to inform the deafblind person, the rider, when to get off. Currently, they use communication cards. Specifically, communication cards, which is a piece of paper that is laminated, that the person may write themselves, or they might have a communication book, or even a notepad, where they'll use that to communicate with the driver. And so the driver can inform them when it's their stop. But that puts a lot of responsibility on the driver. The ADA law does support that the driver must inform the deafblind person to be able to assist them so they can get to their destination where they need to go. But it requires more training and more collaboration. With companies and with businesses to figure out how to develop the technology to really improve the access.
Yeah, and Ryan, that brings up another important point that we kind of mentioned already, but haven't really opened up, but like the ways in which technology play into this. On the one hand, technologies and the advancement of technology can provide new elements of accessibility that are really exciting and really valuable. On the other hand, kind of what you were mentioning before, that the ADA kind of needs to constantly be updated to meet new technologies and continue to address those. Can you talk a little bit more about the interplay of technology and the ADA?
This is Ryan. Wow. Technology has a huge impact on our lives as compared to 30 years ago. Wow. You know, computers were just in their baby stages 30 years ago. The internet was in its infancy. People depended on TV for information. Now you can just swipe your device, your iPad, your tablet, whatever device, your phone even, and just get all the information at the palm of your hands. People use braille displays. You know, before they were these honky, huge, ginormous things. Now they are, you know, they were, rather in the past, they would have almost like a typewriter, right? You had this typewriter where you had to put the paper in and come across, but now there are these sleek little devices that you can carry and are portable. So there's been a lot of change, and that has impacted the lives of deafblind people dramatically. And there's a lot of pros to that. There's an increase in accessibility. There's an increase to information, different kinds of information. In general, our world has more access to information than in the past, and more resources for that. At the same time, as the ADA is, you know, become a little old, a little antiquated, the language doesn't quite fit modern needs and the modern uses of information. And the result of that is we've had to set up new legislation, new amendments to further uphold the ADA. And that's going to happen again. As modern times change and technology changes, our needs, our perspectives, how we get information, communication is going to change. And we will need more legislation to continue to support the ADA.
You know, to just talk about the way that advocacy and accessibility meet when we're talking about, in terms of feeling through specifically, you know, for those of you who are watching this live stream right now on Facebook, you'll see that there are live captions. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, there are not live captions. And just to speak about that and where advocacy plays into this, Facebook, particularly during the COVID, was getting a lot of pressure around being more accessible and making it more accessible. And even in the time that we've been doing these broadcasts, they've started having very, very accurate, I will applaud them for this, very accurate live captioning that they do automatically, that they provide as a free service for any public page that's going live. And certainly it helps us greatly provide accessibility. We were working with a live captioner each episode prior to that, and it was challenging to do that from a cost perspective every time. We still, that captioning service is great, and we still work with them a lot during our Feeling Through Experience live streams. But in order to have that, a lot of people pressured Facebook to have to provide those live captions on these live videos to make it more accessible. And YouTube, and I'm calling YouTube out here, I don't know if we have a large enough following to do anything about this yet, but YouTube has the capability of doing that, but they're rolling it out a lot slower than Facebook. They're only providing it to pages that have 10,000 subscribers or more. We're not quite there yet, but reminder, if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do. It'll help us get there quicker. But they're only making it available to pages with 10,000 or more subscribers, and even still they're rolling it out slowly. So that's something certainly that, just from a very micro lens of looking through, feeling through eyes here, that's something that certainly bothers me, and I've reached out to YouTube about that. didn't hear anything back, but that's something that I'm hoping changes. It feels like such an easy thing to fix in a world where that's such a basic technology that we have, something that Facebook is demonstrating very clearly, and something that certainly Google and YouTube have the capabilities of doing. You know, it's obviously easy for me to say I'm not working on the tech side of those companies, but on the other hand, it's very clear that's something they could be providing. So I hope that's something that changes soon. And, you know, that's a place where I'm trying to advocate, at least to some degree. Haven't made enough noise yet to enact something, but an example, Ryan, to what you were talking about it being important for people to speak up, because it really takes that advocacy and that pressure from individuals to create these changes. I know very well, because they made a public address, Facebook, that it was because so many people spoke up that they started adding some more accessibility features. So very much to your point, Ryan.
This is Ryan. Captioning is one of the largest areas that people that are deafblind need. So for instance, deafblind people can have the ability to customize captioning is also important. So being able to customize the color, the background, the font color, enlarge the print, so on and so forth, make it bold. That would allow deafblind people to access the captioning easier, but most places do not provide that customization. In TV, it's becoming more mainstream. There's more options available, but not yet on the internet. That is a challenge. And not only Facebook, but in the workplace, people encounter when they're doing telework these challenges. So individuals that are working from home, people that are working virtually, joining meetings virtually. These are considerations that need to be made in how to make these modifications and accommodations for people that need captioning and to improve accessibility. You know, modifying the background, changing the lighting, so on and so forth. Someone's internet speed all impacts someone's ability to do telework. You know, locally, my speed is not that great. It is a challenge for me, and that's a challenge to accessibility. So those are issues we're facing today. I have seen improvements, but improvements also take time. We need to continue to advocate once we encounter these issues.
You know, Ryan, I definitely hear you about that internet connectivity. Certainly that's something that's vital to these live streams. And I have had more than my fair share of phone calls and technician visits since we've been doing these live streams to make sure that they are as clear as possible. And fortunately it's worked, but again, a great example. And actually, just to speak to that this is a good little micro example of that, again, something that I've learned about Spectrum, who's my internet service provider, who I've spoken with about 40 times on the phone over the last couple months, and also had several technicians come out. And I think this is so related to what we're talking about as far as advocacy and how the ADA functions. The last technician that came out to me said the whole way, so when the internet got overloaded at the beginning of quarantine, and a lot of areas that weren't used to having that amount of traffic were getting overloaded, they put down a lot of new lines. But the only way to know if there's glitches in the lines is if people file complaints. Otherwise, they're not able to pinpoint where the glitches are. So the whole system is actually reliant on people speaking up and saying when they have a problem. Otherwise, they don't know which part of the line to address, which is, I think, thematically exactly related to what we're talking about as far as the system of enforcing the ADA and accessibility does not work if people don't speak up. It does not work if someone doesn't go to a business and say, hey, this is how you are not being compliant to the ADA. You need to adhere to that. And then still doesn't work if that business goes like, we don't care, and that person doesn't follow through on that. So it's so important. It's something that certainly, can't talk about this right now without mentioning Black Lives Matter. Certainly Black Lives Matter and that movement has gained so much power because how many individual people are speaking up and doing something to create this collective movement. So that's certainly something that resonates across the board right now. I'm going to go to another question here. And again, a reminder to all of you watching, we still have a good amount of time left in this episode. If you're sitting there with any questions at all, please feel free to type those in the chat box and we'll get to them. This question comes from Christopher Lawrence. Hello, Christopher. Thank you for joining us. And he says, I assume that mask wearing has made it difficult for the deaf community to read lips and understand facial expressions when speaking to masked people. Can you speak to this, and has it made your personal or your community's life more challenging?
This is Ryan speaking. And considering the ADA, with its emphasis on its interpreting as an accommodation for effective communication, mask wearing has made it much more difficult because it covers the face. It's a barrier to communication. In social distancing, and again, that social distancing requires 6 feet of separation. That has also made it harder for deafblind people to get the information they need to get that access to services. Many deafblind people rely on touch for access, and you can't use touch anymore because of social distancing. Mask wearing really limits access in getting the information you need. So it restricts the face. What sort of facial expressions are happening on the face are important to sign language. And without that access, there's miscommunication and misunderstanding. Being able to use haptics via touch to get that information either on your shoulder or on your back or whatever, that visual information of what's happening around you, including environmental information, really helps you know. And part of that is facial expressions. But now that's even less. That information is not as out there because deafblind people have to use social distancing. So we have to teach individuals out there how to use the supports we need, such as haptics for communication, so on and so forth, but it is restricted now. Wearing gloves as a way of protection is another challenge. Interpreters and service providers are at times not willing to support because of fear. And the fear is around the coronavirus. It's limiting our deafblind people's ability to get the services and for the people providing the services too. So it's really become very sticky where the ADA is here because there's a law that requires these services to be provided, but at the same time, there's these health restrictions and considerations. So where do those two align with each other? Where is the common ground in the middle, where it's okay to do something given both the law and the current coronavirus situation? So it's tough, it's murky waters.
Yeah. I'm going to go to another question here from Judith, and she asks, Ryan, can you talk about one or more recent big victories for the ADA?
And this is Ryan. Yeah, there's several. Really, there's many, but I'll give you a few examples. I will mention two. The first are various apps and programs that you would use maybe on your phone to order food. Let's say you want to order Domino's pizza. Or perhaps you might even want to use Instacart for a delivery food service. Those are two apps that previously were not accessible. And via complaints and back and forth, it was resolved via courts that they had to redesign their programs to be more accessible with braille displays. So that's one that's one positive outcome for deafblind people is now we can rely on getting food through our, apps to deliver to our home just like everybody else, because we are hungry just like everybody else. Another example of the ADA law is that it has reduced the amount of discrimination in employment services. More and more people can gain employment, and that's good. We are still behind the times. There's still a high percentage of an unemployment rate for people with disabilities, but the numbers have gotten better. We need to consider how to improve the employment environment for people with disabilities, and especially for deafblind people. How can they get a job and successfully do that job by making it more accessible? In the past, deafblind people were considered unemployable. They can't work, they can't hold a job. They should just stay home. Stay home with their family, that will take care of them. Now, however, with the law and the law's protection of their rights, it is commonplace now that deafblind people can work. They might need some sort of advocacy, some sort of support, and the law provides that support. There does, however, still need to be an education, conversation, and dialogue to identify problems and solutions. Because of course, it comes down to money a lot of times. Some resources can be afforded, some cannot. But it's really, you want to have people supporting and advocating for each other rather than, let's say, butting heads. So really focusing on advocacy to find the solutions to satisfy everyone in a given situation, to make sure everyone's needs are met is important.
Very well put, Ryan. And with the final about 9 or so minutes we have here, something that I think might be interesting to touch on if you'd like to share, Ryan. I know that when we were speaking earlier this week, you had a personal story about I believe that when you were back in grad school, that was kind of like an anecdote around this notion of like advocating for and pushing on a topic to affect change. Is that something you'd like to share?
This is Ryan. Sure. One example of how times have changed is in education. Today in education, there's an extra emphasis on internships and practicum. And using internships and practicum to really get your hands in there, really to get that hands-on experience. And now today, with more services provided through Voc Rehab, there's more people out there in the workforce. And there is a lot of debate and stuff, but there's a lot of situations where that hands-on experience is still used. And for students who want to be interns, there's issues that do come up, such as issues for transportation. How to get from point A to point B in a given area. In my local area to get to where I need to work. There was no reasonable accommodation because at that time, it would take 2, 3, 4 hours just for me to get to this site that I needed to be at. And there was another site that was a little bit better, and there was some back and forth. There were some issues that came about during this, during my internship. Also, there's issues with accessibility in the classroom. So when I was done with my descriptions that I had to complete my duties I had to complete in my internship for graduate school, I then needed to teach. And there was a very large struggle around that because I didn't have the reasonable accommodations in place that I needed. And so some of those accommodations were around communication. So there were a lot of frustrations that came about, a lot of issues, because the program didn't really have the options I needed, nor made the modifications. So I wanted to be able to do one-on-one teaching as opposed to classroom teaching. And it was very frustrating, you know, people were like, oh, all this frustration, all these headaches over all of that. And that's a modification, is to make it accessible. There needs to be guidelines for the school program, or rather the educational program, that needs to consider accessibility and what that looks like on an individual basis. Rather than just saying everyone has to follow rules A through Z, coming up with these guidelines. And so that for me was extremely frustrating and caused a lot of undue stress. Just these modifications, just these changes that need to happen can improve everyone's experience. And luckily I had the skills and knowledge to be able to advocate. You know, I wasn't a straight A student. I wasn't necessarily the best student in the class, but I had to speak up and get the internship I needed. And I didn't want to look foolish during this internship, so I needed to speak up. And I did that through advocating, through discussions to figure out what would work. And if we couldn't come up with a solution the first time, we go up to plan B, as well as I would go up a chain of command. And, I went to the Civil Rights Office even as far up to try and resolve these issues. And there's pros and cons to that, in making resolution to these issues. But the ADA protects this type of work and is applicable in these types of challenges with barriers. So I had to go back to the program and really work with them even further to get what I needed to be able to finish my requirements for my graduate degree. And it was a combination really of both the ADA and me advocating that really helped me to get through this challenging time. It's really a two-way street. It wasn't just the ADA alone. It was both the ADA and myself advocating for the change that I needed in my program.
So we have one more question here, and it's from Neelam. Hello, thank you for joining us again. She's from the NFADB, the National Family Association for the DeafBlind. You can check them out. They're a great organization. And she asks, is there any research on income disparity between the deafblind population and the general population, and within the deafblind population as well?
And just to clarify, the question is about the disparity in income, correct? So I just want to clarify the question. This is Ryan. In considering the accessibility issues and the barriers for people that are deafblind, as well as maintaining their independence, how to become successful at work using technology and various tools. including knowledge and knowledge of the ADA. The deafblind community and deafblind individuals might feel that others out there don't understand them and what their needs are. They may feel more limited, when in fact, mentally, they're not limited in capability, but others might perceive them to be that way. So they need to advocate and educate and speak up, expressing their thoughts and their concerns, explaining what they can do. Compared to the past, where there was focusing on limitation, now we're focused more on the individual's strengths. And by focusing on the individual's strengths, that changed our perspective. And that changes other people's perspective of those individuals with disabilities. There's a, the cultural competency in fitting with those around them. So it's very important to learn advocacy, because that really helps individuals in the community and working with other people to identify solutions. The law is powerful, but it also is about us empowering ourselves and working to identify the solutions and coming up to figure out how to change these barriers and make it ultimately a positive situation. So that's really the big picture. Deafblind people really need to learn about that. And the deafblind community knows a lot about that, but needs to inform other people who might not. And that way, we can all work together to make change. And it's a really important consideration.
Well, thank you for that, Ryan, and thank you for all of you joining us today. We will be back next week, same time, same place. And again, just a couple reminders. If you are watching on Facebook, please make sure you're liking our Facebook page and also subscribing to our YouTube page, and vice versa for our YouTube subscribers. Please also, in addition to subscribing to our channel, please like our Facebook page and our other social medias that you might use more, our Twitter or our Instagram. We're at Feeling Through on all the things, or youtube.com/feelingthrough. And it's really a great way to stay in touch with all of the screening announcements we have, new episodes, and a lot of other really exciting stuff we're going to be talking about soon. And in fact, an even better way to stay up to date on everything is if you go to feelingthrough.com and you sign up for our mailing list. We actually just announced our the next chance to see the Feeling Through Experience live stream, which will be on Tuesday as part of the Indie Shorts Film Festival. We'll be doing the whole Feeling Through experience there. So you can find out more information by following our social media and signing up for our mailing list. And we have a lot of other really exciting announcements that we'll be making soon. And again, if you enjoy this and you know friends or family or colleagues that you think might find this interesting or benefit from it, please do share it with other people as well. And lastly, in celebration of ADA30, we have some really cool special ADA30 Feeling Through gear in our store at feelingthrough.com/store. So check that out. We also have a bunch of other stuff in there that's really cool, some really great designs. And as always, a portion of the proceeds goes directly to Helen Keller Services, and the rest helps fund future Feeling Through experiences and endeavors. So thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and we will see you next week. Bye, everyone.